Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Collaborative Conversations on Building a Culture of Writing, a series designed to build teachers' capacity for writing instruction. Before we start the live conversation, we invite you to start and continue the conversation on Twitter. Use hashtag Culture of Writing to start the conversation. And we do apologize for this morning's delay. Today is the first or the second K-5 session entitled Assessing Writing. In this session, participants will delve into the wealth of knowledge they can gain through assessing student writing and examine how this information can be effectively used to guide further instruction. So without further delay, let's build a culture of writing as Dr. Roberta Gardner and Julie Owens share best practices for assessing writing.
Hello, I'm Dr. Roberta Gardner, and I'm a clinical assistant professor at Georgia State University, where I teach courses in reading and writing methods. I spent 10 years as a school media specialist and as a literacy support in various capacities within and outside of schools. And in my research in writing, I focused on the identity and social and cultural aspects of reading and writing development. Julie?
Hello, I'm so happy to be here, you guys. My name's Julie Owens. I was a teacher for 7 years in Clayton County in a Title I school system. There I taught first grade. The majority of my time I taught fifth grade writing and reading, and I also taught special education. Within my classroom, I used a number of strategies. My students didn't come to me reading on level, so I knew I couldn't just dive straight into writer's workshop type models. So I had to use explicit modeling, authentic writing tasks to get some buy-in. I conferred with my students weekly, and feedback and choice were also ways that I got them to write. Within my classroom, I built a culture of writing, and I think that that changed my writing scores by raising them from 69% to 93% in the 3 years that I taught. But more important to me, my students left with a love of writing. And I feel like that was because of the culture of writing that we had in my classroom. Currently, I'm a doc student at Georgia State University and a clinical faculty member with research interests that include self-regulated strategy development in students with emotional and behavior disorders and self-concept in adolescent girls.
So in this session, similar to in the first session, we're going to emphasize focusing on the writer, not simply the writing. And we do this by consistently positioning students as writers and by often placing emphasis on teaching writing as a process and not merely a product. We know that emphasis on process makes writing strategies visible rather than making writing feel like something that's innate. And by doing this, we also give students the opportunity to see that writing is a process of trial and error. And so we're going to be talking about that and talking about building confidence and support systems and positioning students as writers through language moves like calling them writers. Right. And that's really important to be consistent with that and constantly giving them opportunities to write.
Right. I think it's important that even though today we're talking about assessing writing, it's important to know that we are not just assessing the writing product, we are assessing the process. That is really what I hope that you get anything out of today, that you think about that when it comes to assessment. So before, we wanted to make sure that before we talk about assessing writing, you got to be teaching writing. And there's a number of different ways that can be done. We're not saying that there's one specific way. It's not one right way. You've got to find what works for you and what works for your students. There are a number of strategies on this screen that you can use to teach writing. Explicit modeling is what I utilized in my classroom a lot because I couldn't just go in and expect them to get to a certain place and just jump to writing a 5-paragraph essay. I had to model what that looked like.
Absolutely. And, you know, any of these strategies that are listed here can be used within a writing workshop framework. And something that we also don't want to leave out that's not necessarily noted is the importance of mentor text and exposure to mentor text, because this gives students the opportunity to engage and to see different text structures and to hear writing in ways that are fluid. And in doing that, then they actually have something to refer back to too during conferencing, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Right. A few guiding questions we have for today. One of them is going to be, how do I use formative assessments in my writing?
Another is, how do I effectively use rubrics within the writing workshop?
Today we're also going to talk about, what does doing a writing conference actually look like?
And how can we help feedback? How can feedback rather be used to drive students' writing?
And all of these, how does the assessment really going to guide my instruction?
So talking about the difference between assessment and evaluation is important. Noting that assessment is basically gathering information, and it can be used by both students as well as the teacher to inform and identify strengths and areas for growth. Evaluation, on the other hand, is more summative in nature. It's often graded or ranked and used at the end of a unit. It can, however, be used formatively if, and that is highlighted, teachers choose to adjust teaching to address the students' needs.
Right. So I'm coming at you as a teacher, right? So to us, teaching assessment's what's really going to affect our instruction. Evaluation is more often the summative, the end of the milestones test, the benchmark. It's for kind of the other stakeholders to kind of rank our students. Assessment's what we are doing constantly throughout the teaching that's going to affect our teaching.
Absolutely.
This diagram kind of sets it up for me and shows it in a bunch of different ways, because your assessing is cyclical. It's happening all the time. Before they come to you, you need to see where they start. While you're teaching, you're assessing formatively along the way, throughout. And then you provide summative assessments to see, hey, what I taught, did it work? Did it stick? And it's happening all the time throughout.
That's right. Yeah, so just constantly a recursive process of moving back and forth between the students' writing, what they're producing, and what is needed to go forward. Right. So Julie, can you talk just a little bit about what some of these different assessments look like in the classroom? Like, what did the diagnostic tests look like?
Right. Diagnostic more so was at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of units. You would test to kind of see, hey, what do they know? What are they coming to me knowing? You can definitely get a student's file and look at their milestone test, but really sitting down and looking at a writing piece that you did at the beginning to see what they're really coming to you with. So they're baselines, they're pre-test. Formatives are more so you're doing it all the time while you're teaching. Not just at the end. It's not just you're waiting and assessing at the end, which is more summative. This is while I'm teaching, in the middle of my teaching, hey, did you get what I just said? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. You know, give me a 5 if you're getting what I'm saying. Assessment doesn't have to be a written product that you're grading, and that's kind of what formative is, and that's what we're really going to focus on today.
That's right. And those examples that are provided there through journal writing, looking at essays and writing to prompts, those kinds of elements that are embedded within classroom practice are ways that you can use for formative assessment.
Right. There's so many different things you can use. And this is not just in the act of ELA. Formative assessments and assessing their writing can happen from conceptual understanding in math. It can happen from a constructed response in social studies or science. You can use that formative assessment to assess their writing throughout the day and throughout subjects.
That's right. Yeah, and we'll be talking more about how everyone should be teaching writing. Right.
The summatives are going to be your county genre assessments, your 5th grade writing assessment, your 3rd grade writing assessment. This is, okay, after we've taught all of the writing standards, now we're going to assess, did they get it? And this next slide kind of shows that one does not simply use one data point to make critical decisions. And I feel like sometimes that's happening out there. We're only using the summative writing piece to assess our students. But if we didn't formatively discuss with them along the way, you're doing this great. You could do this better. Here, let's go back and revise this. If we're not formatively working with them throughout the process, and we're just giving them that one summative grade at the end, We're not giving them a chance to grow.
Yeah, we have to ask ourselves, is that really a valid assessment?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So in the study that we're showing now, it found that pre-service and in-service teachers were looking at students as readers and writers and making assessments of them in one fell swoop. They were basically summing up what students could do based on observations and inferences, rather than looking at and considering student perspectives or taking an inquiry stance. And we know that that's a problem with writing because they don't have an opportunity to grow. If we, box them in and say that the student is a low-level writer or the student exceeds, because we also know that students who perform well in one genre might need support in writing in another genre. And so through conferencing, we have the opportunity for students to move along a range as writers, and through the formative assessment, we don't have to fall into this trap of basically objectifying students.
Right. It's a process, and it's fluid, and you can move up and down. A student might come to me excelling in narrative writing and really blowing me away, but really struggles to, read text and respond to text in informational writing. So you can't just, put a student into a box and consider them, oh, they're a struggling writer. You've got to assess them throughout and allow them to have certain strengths and move along the process of the writing.
Yeah, looking at, who they are currently, but also who they can become as a writer is really important. So the notebooks as an assessment tool is really important because in notebooks, students often will exhibit a different kind of writing. Many times students will take more risk in their notebooks that they won't take in sort of this high demand writing that is put before them quite often. What would you like to add to that, Julie?
I used a writing notebook every day in my classroom. We wrote every day. And I did, one of the things that I had within my classroom was a writer's wake up. It was just a little prompt, or sometimes it would be free choice, write about whatever you want. And that little 5 to 10 minutes was some of the best writing I got out of my students all year long. Because it was, I told them, don't focus on grammar, don't focus on spelling. We're just getting the ideas out, we're waking that writer up within us. Right. And they threw a lot into it, and it was some of the best writing. And sometimes they'd go back, and I'd be like, you need to go back and develop that into a story. That's awesome. But yes, writing as a notebook can definitely be used as a great assessment tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So another element for formative assessment are checklists. Checklists are particularly useful for students in kindergarten, first and second grade, early writers, to help to move them along, and they serve as a point of reference for them to see if they're following some of those grammar rules. Okay. That's really big, but making sure that they use capital letters and punctuation, that's one of the ways to really help younger writers.
Another way that I really loved checklists were they were usable as a teacher. I didn't have to go and grade every single aspect of a writing. I could be, did they have an introduction? Did they indent their paragraphs? And you can cater it to what you actually taught. So checklists are a great way to assess what you taught in that lesson or in that unit.
So skimming. Talk a little bit about that, Julie.
Formative assessments, I need to keep saying this because it's so important. It informs your teaching. So you don't have to, we departmentalized. I had 95 students. I didn't have a chance to read every single essay every single week, start to finish in depth with an analytic rubric. Sometimes I was skimming for certain parts. Did they use dialogue? Did they quote the text? And so I'm just trying to show you different ways that you can go and assess the writing, and it doesn't have to be so formal with the rubric every single time.
Sure. And like you mentioned before, like these are opportunities to develop mini lessons for, subsequent sequence lessons for students in the writing workshop framework. Also multiple formats. Ticket out the door, that's really popular. Right. Talk about some of the other things that you've used.
Right. When we think about assessing writing, I think we get stuck with thinking we have to grade the whole entire essay. But sometimes we can just assess whether they got the many lessons we taught. Write an example of a thesis statement, and that's your ticket out the door. Give me 3 things that we include in a narrative writing,
Sure.
So 3, 2, 1. And you're just checking to see whether they got the standards that you taught that week. It doesn't have to be every single time an essay.
Yeah. It goes back to the dialogical element of writing, and I don't think that we place enough emphasis on the importance of writing as a social process, right? So using formative assessment through dialogue is another important aspect. Also looking for patterns. Absolutely. Patterns in the lessons can show that there are gaps, and it tells you again how to develop future lessons. If you see that many of your students really have weak, hooks, then that tells you what kind of mini lesson to create for the next week.
Right. So when you're grading your assessments, whether it is you're skimming or you're using a checklist, and you're going through and you're starting to develop patterns. Oh my goodness, I see that I taught 2 lessons on writing a firm introduction, yet I don't really know what everybody's opinion is. They're not clearly stating their opinion. Then you're going to need to go back and reteach there, Or you're seeing a pattern of these students are really getting it. I could push them higher by having them add figurative language. Where could I push them? So it's not always where do I help my struggling students. You also got to think about the patterns of how do I push my gifted students into a higher elevated writing.
Absolutely. I would also add too, Julie, that's a space where again the mentor texts come in. It kind of tells you, where you can use examples and introduce students to authors who are already making certain moves in their writing.
Definitely. And I've talked to Dr. Gardner about this before. Sometimes if I couldn't find a mentor text, I wrote it myself.
Yeah.
Like if I needed to show my students what I wanted them to do, as teachers, we kind of got to get over our fear of writing, and we've got to model it for our students. What does it look like? If I want them to write a really good, persuasive essay, then sometimes I got to show them myself what it looks like.
That definitely taps back into something we talked about in session 1 about teachers looking at who they are as writers.
Right. So we've got some examples here. We wanted to include different grade levels to let you know that writing's not just for our 5th graders, you guys. Writing happens in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. My 1st graders definitely were rocking it when we were in 1st grade. So here are some assessments that you could use in your kindergarten, 2nd grade classrooms in the form of checklists. And you may focus more on spacing and handwriting and capital letters in the younger grades, but you can also move up and how were my ideas? Did I include a character? Definitely look at the genres as well and the standards.
Yeah, and as a reference point, someone we talked about in session 1 too was author Katie Wood-Ray, who wrote a phenomenal text called About the Authors, and it was based on experiences with kindergarten writers and the fact that they constantly position those kindergartners as writers to the point where they were creating their texts and saying, oh, I'm writing just like Eric Carle.
Right.
And so again, these are examples of some general checklists. But as Julie mentioned, as you introduce new texts, think about ways that your writers can experiment, like the exemplary authors that are out there.
Exactly. And I want to caution you guys about going and just finding checklists on the internet. Sometimes they don't align with our Georgia standards. Sometimes they don't align with what you actually taught. And so you want to make sure that you're catering your checklist to what you taught your students. So they're great and, work smarter, not harder, but you may need to adjust to fit your students.
Absolutely.
So formative assessments are a guide to help your students reach the final destination. So let's remember
that formative feedback, it allows for changes to be made that can get the student closer to meeting the standards. And we're going to talk more about the feedback because much research has shown the high effects of feedback and what they provide.
Right, our formative assessments aren't so much focused on the grades and the outcome as much as the feedback and the changes that can come from them, both from teachers and students.
Formative assessments also emphasize the process and not a test. Again, we really want to emphasize again and again, not focusing so much on the product itself, but that process of writing.
And we can't just give a summative assessment and consider it valid when we haven't been teaching and assessing along the way. I'm going to say that a couple times because I think that we fall victim to that sometimes because we have a lot on our plates. I know, I was a teacher, I get it. But we've got to make sure that we're giving students a chance to grow, and the only way they can grow is if we're doing formative assessments and giving them feedback and giving them that chance.
Yeah, and actually giving them the opportunity to write.
Exactly.
It goes back to Ralph Fletcher really emphasized in one of his texts that if we're only writing with students once a week, the only thing we're really teaching them is to hate writing.
Right. Yes. We've got my students walked away with a sense of being, writers, and that's what we've got to build. We've got to build the writer within these students. And if we're beating them down with their grammar and giving them summative assessments with just a grade on it and not telling them what they did great, then where's their motivation to continue? Where's their motivation to actually write and get better?
Absolutely.
I, as a student right now, feel that way. If I don't get my proper feedback when I turn in papers, I'm not motivated to do better the next time.
Sure. And again, that's what the data showed across the board from elementary writers all the way up to adult writers. They found that feedback was that generative source for motivating writers.
Okay, we're going to talk about rubrics, and I don't want you to have a response to this because sometimes when people talk about rubrics when it comes to writing, it's like, oh, no, because they do take a lot of time. And so today we're going to talk about how to make rubrics work for you.
Yeah, so just really maybe, Julie, emphasize the pros and the cons of each of the rubrics.
So today we're going to talk about holistic, analytic, and teacher-made rubrics. Holistic just kind of grade the overall quality of writing. The pros are they don't take a lot of time to grade. The con is they can be kind of subjective, right? They use those words like mostly and partially and not at all. And the way I look at an essay and grade it could be completely different from the way that you look at an essay and think of mostly and partially. So holistic rubrics, they're subjective. There's definitely a place for them sometimes if you're trying to, all right, it's a pre-assessment, I'm kind of getting a sense of where my students are. These students are kind of below standards, these students are meeting standards, these students are exceeding standards, then a holistic rubric's a great place to start.
Sure.
Analytic are more of what we see in the classroom. They're point by point. They're usually separated by genres. I use these in the classroom, but more than ever I created my own because I wasn't going to give my students analytic summative rubrics after I taught informational for a week. But I also wanted them to know how I was assessing them. So if I only taught for a week and we had only gone through introduction and organization, then those were the only two things on my analytic rubric.
Yeah. It gives you a chance to individualize for your students.
Exactly. And to reach success. I'm not going to measure them on things that I haven't taught them.
That's right.
Which goes back to teacher-made. So teacher-made, you can make it specific to your students and the lessons that you covered, and you can cater teacher-made to holistic and analytic rubrics. We've got some examples coming up.
So one of the cons, though,
Yeah.
that we had talked about also was the fact that these do take time when you create them. They do. And so at the same time, once you do it and you get into a rhythm, I think that in the end it's helpful, for your students, right? Which is
Right.
what we really want to do anyway.
Exactly. And I would get together with your grade levels, get together with your school, and have rubric making parties. It's not,
Yeah.
you don't think of it as a party, but if you all get together and you put your minds together and you think about what's a rubric that's going to be successful, then it's not just that year that you're going to use it. You can use it from year to year, and you can expand on it. And if you create a really great rubric that encompasses the entire persuasive standard, then you can pull elements out of it and adjust it to make teacher-made rubrics.
Sure.
So we have some examples of holistic rubrics, and you can kind of see when you do holistic rubrics, you have to have a deep knowledge of the standard, okay? Because if you're looking at this one and it says has a complete understanding of narrative writing, then you're going to need to know what the first grade narrative writing standard is and really understand it to see if that student has a complete understanding. So if you were going to use holistic rubrics, I would also attach the standard to them as well.
Absolutely.
To keep you grounded.
Yeah. So,
and as you get more into the upper grades, the standards get longer with more and more elements. So being aware of holistic rubrics and with these guiding words such as contains most, contains some of the elements, contains very few, making sure that you have a knowledge of the standard as you use those.
Absolutely. And one thing that I will add is as we continue to talk about rubrics, I keep going back to exposure to text and hearing a lot of narrative writing or hearing a lot of persuasive writing and being exposed to informational writing so that when students are positioned as writers themselves, they have had the opportunity to hear the language, to know what kind of text features are within the genres, and that's just really, really important. And I know that one of the gaps that I've noticed sometimes in classrooms is that the students just don't have enough exposure to various texts.
Definitely, definitely. And when it comes to exposure of the rubrics, I would not be exposing my students to holistic rubrics. If you gave your students holistic rubrics, and don't you think that they would click, yeah, of course, my paper provides all of the elements of the narrative writing.
Sure.
My students would have thought that every single time.
That's right.
So holistic rubrics are more so a teacher rubric. Definitely don't want to give these to our students. Analytic rubrics, on the other hand, when you're going point by point, now these our students can use. Here's a kindergarten analytic rubric, and I actually created these rubrics, and all I did was I went and I looked at the standards and I pulled the elements of the standard out and put them into sections.
And I noticed too, like in the ideas portion, you talk about students' oral story is unrelated to a picture drawn. One thing that we really didn't emphasize or talk about yet was the role of oral language in writing and the importance of students being able to talk through ideas, which we're more of that with conferencing, but that still is a really important step for students as a writer and a way for teachers to assess students.
We are going to talk about it when it comes to conferring, but when you're creating your rubrics, you've got to value that aspect of writing just as much. You've got to value it and make sure that you're reading the standard enough. Like it says, use a combination of drawing, dictating, and writing in kindergarten, which means Georgia Performance Standards are valuing all of these combos, and we need to as teachers as well. Kindergarten and first grade is where we start to develop these students as writers. And so we need to be making sure that if they're doing these skills, that we're giving them credit for it. And,
absolutely.
Just being able to tell a great story, that's a great skill. That's exceeding standards. If you're telling a great story, you eventually can write a great story.
That's right. Yeah. So again, that point is to move them along that continuum.
I wanted to show this example because I pulled just kind of emphasizing taking rubrics from the internet and putting them in our classroom without really reading them. So if you look at this rubric, does this really address the standard? The standard is Wright's narrative in which they recount 2 or more appropriately sequenced events, include some details regarding what happened, use temporal words to signal event order, and provide some sense of closure. And when you look at this rubric, which is a narrative rubric for first grade, in first glance, without really looking at the standard right next to it, yeah, this is a pretty good rubric. But when you look at the standard, it's not really addressing what we're supposed to be teaching. Half of the rubric is just addressing grammar and spelling, and then the other two that are addressing the actual writing don't hit the elements of the standard.
Yeah, it's definitely not consistent.
Exactly. So making sure that when you're creating rubrics, you can actually pull elements of the rubric standard out and put them into the rubric like this one with opinion pieces in first grade. So I wanted to go ahead and talk about the upper grades because the emphasis gets higher with writing in the upper grades for sure. And rubrics can get overwhelming for teachers and for students because look at all the elements that are encompassed here in this fourth grade informational standard. When you're putting all of those onto a rubric, and this is just has exceeds and below standards, the rubric gets really extensive. And we want our students to be able to read rubrics because we want to know what they're graded on. So I wanted to show that this might be a summative rubric that we would use at the end, where we're kind of assessing point by point every single element. But you can take that rubric and turn it into something that's actually going to be used by you and your students in your classroom. This is just simplifying the language of the standard in a way where students can actually go through and say, hey, did I introduce my topic? Do I have headings and graphics? And you as a teacher can go through and grade using a rubric like this much more efficiently than an extensive rubric with every single element.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is important to notice as you look at this fourth grade rubric is that there's a synthesis of skills that has been built along the way, so that even though there's a lot more that students are supposed to be able to do when they get in fourth and fifth grade, that means that in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, they really need to be writing a lot.
Exactly.
Right? So that when they get to this point, you are starting to synthesize, and that the conversations about putting details in writing, that all of that makes sense because they've been hearing it along the way.
Exactly. And I think when I started teaching in fifth grade for the first time, I realized the disconnect because students were coming to me and not having really written a lot in the previous grades because I was the fifth grade teacher and it was the fifth grade writing assessment, and that's when the emphasis started. And you can't really make up 5 years of gains in that one year. I made miracles happen, but it helps a lot when we're starting it from a very young age and building it up and building that writer.
That's right. It goes back to the notion that we grounded this whole conversation about building a culture of writing in terms of working on the identity of the writer.
And rubrics don't have to just be used in the writing class or in English language arts. You can use rubrics and assess writing in math when students are explaining their conceptual understanding.
Yes, and procedures. I think in kindergarten, first graders working with their notebooks and being able to, create observations, note observations rather, in their notebooks. That's another way that writing occurs in other disciplinary areas, and we can assess them in those ways as well.
We definitely know that writing is happening in science and social studies. We're moving towards those document-based questions and text informational writing where we're comparing these scientific articles and then writing about them. The important thing to note is that it's okay that we're writing across the genres, but some teacher along the way is going to actually have to teach the writing process. We can't just be passing the buck and thinking, oh, well, the science teacher is going to be doing that when they're doing informational writing, or the social studies teacher is going to teach the writing when it's time for document-based, or the English language arts teacher. You as a team, you as a school are going to have to figure out who's going to be teaching this writing process that we are assessing in every single subject.
That's right. Yeah. It's so true. And I think, if students are going to identify text features, then again, they need to be having exposure to exemplary writing within social studies.
Mm-hmm.
And that occurs not just with the textbook, but with, injecting trade books into the curriculum in ways that might be useful for ELA teachers as well.
Definitely.
So we've had a lot, we've talked,
Right.
we've really flooded you with a lot of information, and so we want to be able to pause for a bit and take some of your questions.
Any questions, assessments, what do they look like in the classroom, or any questions about these rubrics? Or are we just doing such a great job answering all of the questions?
So right now, we don't have any questions, but we do encourage our audience, if you do, feel free to type them in, and our participants, our panelists, will share their wisdom.
Yeah, we're happy to pause if we go down the line and people have questions. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on and talk about one of the most important aspects of assessing writers, and that is feedback and providing feedback. We know that feedback is especially powerful if the teacher helps the learner to know what progress the student has made so far, okay, where they're going and what specific activities they can do to improve their writing or to help the reader to gain access to the text that they've written.
Exactly. I think that this is actually where you take your writing to the next level. You can use your rubrics, you can formatively assess, but where I saw major change happen with my students was when I was sitting down and conferring with them and actually giving them verbal feedback, writing on their paper, something they could take back to their desk and look at later. So conferring and feedback was where I actually saw a major shift in my students as writers.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It goes back to that idea that writing is a social process. I mean, there are people who talk about how we actually never write alone.
Right.
And I think that's important to consider. So these 6 characteristics of writing conferences is something that Julie and I talked about, that even though Donald Graves conceptualized this in 1982, they continue to be a mainstay because it works.
Yeah.
You want to say a little bit more about that?
Don't fix it, right?
Right.
So you want to have a predictable structure. How are you setting up your conferences? Your students want to know what's it going to look like when they come and talk to you. They want to know that it's a comfortable setting. You want to focus on a few points. You don't want to throw everything but the kitchen sink at them. You're not going to say, okay, and spend 45 minutes analyzing every single aspect. We're going to pull out a few strengths. We're going to pull out a few things that you can go back and fix right now. You want to demonstrate solutions to students' problems. So you can't just say, hey, let's go back and have a clear introduction paragraph. You might model that for them right there. What would revision actually look like? This is where we start to model that, because our students a lot of times come at us, they wrote it, it's perfect, nothing's wrong with it. What do you mean revise? It's done, it's great. Conferencing is where we actually get to show them and model for it, like how they can kick it up. This is awesome, you're right. You can take it to the next level.
Absolutely. It's like conferencing provides teachers with a window into students' thinking. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that it does is it positions students and teachers as producers and distributors of knowledge. We cannot forget that we write for a reason. We write for authentic purposes. And so when we conference with students, we get a deeper, we get a better opportunity to get at, what do you really want your reader to know?
Exactly. Sure. Which goes to, eventually you can start to have role reversals. So you're definitely going to start out where you're going to be guiding the conference. But after a while, it can reverse and you can have your students come to you and say, hey, when you come to me, tell me what you want to work on. Point out to me where you think your strengths and weaknesses are. And when they start to come at you and are talking like a writer, like, I really feel like my conclusion's just not strong enough, Miss Owens, and it'll definitely fill your heart. Like,
yeah.
You know that you're building a writer.
You're right. You're right. And that phrase, where do you want to go as a writer, is such an important one when you're conferencing with students, because, again, it positions them in that way. And I think, like you said, then they start to absorb that and speak that language.
And throughout the whole entire conferencing process, you're using that vocabulary. You're calling them an author. You're calling them a writer, using the language of the standard. You know, your opinion piece had very good structure. You need to make sure that you're explaining it with reasons, which, you know, you're definitely just reteaching the standard over and over again, but it's starting to internalize, and they can start to self-regulate, which is the ultimate goal. We want them to be able to write without us. But building that self-regulation during the conferencing is really important. And then, to me, the most important process is building pleasure. This is where you get to kind of build them up.
Right.
Kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Oh my goodness, this idea is amazing. And you start to build them as a writer. They see it. They want to take more risk with you.
Right. Yeah, and they speak to each other that way too. That's another way you can assess yourself, which we'll be talking about teachers assessing themselves as writing teachers very shortly. But I think you can assess yourself by listening to your students and the way they talk about themselves and each other as writers.
Now, there's no clear path when it comes to conferences. I don't have this is how a conference goes. You do this first, you do this second, because you've really got to find what works for your class and what works for your students.
These are just some guidelines and ideas.
So when it comes to scheduling, you got to figure out, how often am I going to try to do this in my classroom? Am I going to try to see everybody in a week? Am I going to try to see a certain number of students? Am I going to do it small group? So try different things. Find out what works for you.
Absolutely. And peer conferencing, that's another way that you can embed practice too, by allowing students to talk to each other.
Exactly.
And then getting feedback from both of them.
Right. When you build that, this is going to be a norm in our classroom, this is something that we're doing, then, and you've modeled it with your students individually, then they can start to lead more effective peer conferencing. And it's not just pass this to your student, let him fix your grammar. They can actually start to talk to each other about the writing process as well.
Sure. Remember those days.
Right? Conferring notebooks. Organization is key. So making sure that you have a notebook set up with everybody as a student sheet in there where you can go back and refer to. This is a great assessment tool. I can go back and say, okay, I've talked for the past 3 sessions with this student about a strong introduction, and we're still struggling there. They may need some more, they may need an intervention here or something more explicit modeling, something, a graphic organizer to help them go there. But you have that data.
That's right.
It's the tool.
So you noted here conferencing norms, explicitly teaching conferencing routines. That can be built into many lessons, right? Early on in the year, teaching students about how writing is going to take place and what the culture is going to be like can occur early on, so that when you get to October, November, and February, these are routines that are fluid.
Right. My classroom ran awesome by January.
Okay. Okay.
Like when you have all of these conferencing norms, but you have to make sure that you put these things into place. Because if you don't have these things into place and you just go in and try to just like start conferencing, you're going to have students, what do I do when I'm done? I need to go to the restroom, interrupting your conferencing. So making sure that they know that, like, hey, when I'm working with Roberta, it's just me and Roberta, This is also where my mantra came in, a writer's never done, they can always make it better. If you meet any of my old writing students, they would say that, because you're never done,
Sure.
You're never done.
Right. You're not.
You can always revise me.
Yeah, absolutely. So exploring technology is an important aspect of conferencing, because let's just look at something like informational writing, right? Knowing that sometimes you need to bolster your resources, sometimes you need to, have conversations about, is this an effective source that you're using? it all depends on, where your students are too. Kindergarten, the conversation with kindergartners, obviously it's going to be very different than with fifth graders. But the role of technology is an important piece of conferencing. You want to talk about, some of the things that you did?
And there's also just trying to think about time constraints that we have as teachers. You can explore. There's some amazing technology out there where you can provide audio feedback. You can actually take a picture of the student's writing, go home, sit on your couch in your pajamas, and give feedback. And then the students can come the next day and hear it and apply it. And so you could give 20 students feedback the night before, go in, have those 20 listening to their feedback while you work with a small group.
Which is something they actually really love too, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Technology, I'm listening.
Yeah.
And then the students that have special needs that need to hear it multiple times or go back and, you're not having to repeat yourself, they can go back and hear it as many times as they need. Yeah. You can also use Google Docs where you're like exploring a document together, or I used Edmodo a lot where my students would submit writing, I could get feedback and submit it back.
And they love it too because you're providing them that one-on-one attention.
Exactly.
I think students don't always get enough of sometimes with the hurried pace.
Exactly.
Sure.
But conferencing is one of the things that you can completely individualize because you're looking at that student's writing. What does this student have as a strength? Where can they grow? So it's a really great place to differentiate. So the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to conferencing is just don't give up. You may have scheduling conflicts. You may not be able to conference for 2 weeks due to weird scheduling things. But don't give up. Try it. It's worth it. It's a great assessment tool, and it can really push your students to the next level as writers.
Sure. I think also figuring out which pieces you're going to conference with students about is also important too.
Right.
That could be a really important time save.
And then just reiterating the fact that research has shown that feedback regarding text clarity can facilitate changes in revising behaviors of students. Because really, that just kind of makes sense, is if we're not giving them feedback and showing them where they can grow, what is their motivation to go back and revise?
Yeah.
So we've got to give them that feedback, and here you could go here, or you need to do this better, or this is great, do this again, is definitely going to teach them how to revise. It's not just a skill we're born with. I wish. So conferences should be a point where include points where you're showing their strengths while aiding in a deeper understanding of their deficits. It's not a place to point out every single thing that's wrong.
It becomes overwhelming,
It does.
I think. And it's, again, that's the space where we can focus too much on the product, right? Rather than the process, or rather than, because it starts to feel discouraging.
Right.
If you only hear about ways that you have not succeeded.
Exactly. And we as teachers tend to gravitate towards fixing grammar and fixing spelling. And conferences shouldn't just be about those elements, because the writing standards, if you look at them, aren't solely focused on a student's ability to spell or punctuate. So if we're developing the writer, we need to also include places in that writing conference where we say what they're doing great.
Yeah, talking about voice, talking about, like, as you mentioned before, this is a great organizational structure. Word choice, what a fabulous word here.
Right.
I can really feel the tension, that you put in your story. So having those rich conversations about their ideas, about some of the excellent choices that they've made as writers to help us to visualize even, what's happening when they describe spending the day with their grandpa in a narrative.
Right. Yeah. It's a place to kind of, you can definitely point out, like, instead of saying, I've read your persuasive essay and I don't see any of the parts that we've identified in our lessons, right? Instead, flip it, say something they did great, and then say, okay, hey, where is your topic sentence? Where's your opinion in this piece? I know that we talked about that in our mini lesson. Can you show me? Because they may see it a different way, and you can point it out, and then you can help guide them into making it more clear.
Sure. So these aspects of affirmative teacher talk that you have here are really important aspects of, again, building the writer up and helping the writer to see where they can enrich their writing in ways that don't diminish, their effort.
Right. And I'm not saying that you can't address handwriting or spelling or grammar, for sure. Because that if you can't read their writing, then that is a barrier. But instead of saying, your handwriting is still a mess and I can't see anything, point out something that they're doing great and then say, hey, why do we need to properly space the writing? Like, why is that important? For me as a reader, why? And so then they start to see and, get more buy-in. It's like, okay, well, if she can't read it, then I guess I do need to try a little harder. Sure. Or we could also offer alternatives. They can type. If handwriting is going to be such a problem, let's offer them.
So again, the research on feedback is just overwhelmingly positive in terms of what it provides for students. As you can see, according to Graham, even adults have had huge effect sizes improving their writing when they receive feedback. Right. When somebody talks to you explicitly about what's needed, where do I go from here? That gives us power to do something about it.
And it's not as effective if we wait and only give the feedback once it's graded, right? So if we only provide feedback at the summative assessment and we don't allow them any chance to go back and revise and improve, then there's no motivation to do it. So not to say that the feedback isn't valuable there, it's just not as valuable.
Sure. And also the notion of providing multiple forms of feedback. That's something that you talked about a little bit earlier, and we talked about verbal and oral and peer feedback, and knowing that, again, it reiterates the social aspect of writing, that it involves conversation and dialogical processes.
Exactly. And then there's also a place for self-evaluation and self-feedback. Going back to those checklists and having students point out, I did this really well. I could do this better. And feedback can come in multiple forms, and it's just so impactful, and it's such a great form of assessment.
Yeah, and that point about prioritizing the needs, I think is really important and a very real factor for teachers who are working within standards-based contexts.
Right.
You want to add anything to that?
Well, you kind of got to be realistic. If my students are coming to me and I have students that are struggling to formulate coherent sentences, then I'm not going to jump into organization and defending their reasons with explanations and citing the text, right? I've got to start where that student is, and I've got to work with them on formulating coherent sentences and subject-verb agreement, or I've got to meet them where they're at.
That's right.
To get them to the standards. I can't just jump into this 5th grade standard where I really need to meet them at a few grade levels below.
That's right. And again, I think it touches upon, if you're looking at the whole school context, knowing that if horizontal grade levels are writing along the way, that's going to help the student in the long run. Because again, too often we're seeing a push and an emphasis in this level of alarm when students get to 5th grade.
Right.
And we're describing the ways that they really need support that they haven't gotten along the way, unfortunately.
Right. So you still may have a ton of questions. What does a conference look like? Do I even fix their grammar at all? What if I can't read their writing? How long is a conference supposed to last? What do I say to the student? And the answers are, I can't really give you. Because, once again, it's individualized. And it's individualized for your students, what works for you as a teacher, and what your students need. We do have an example that we can show you of a real 5th grader's writing that I got permission to use. And and we're going to take a look at it, and there's also an activity that you're going to be doing afterwards so you can practice.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this kind of goes back to in session 1, Kate Woodbridge and I talked about really embedding practices early on in the school year. We talked about this idea of I'm the kind of writer who, in giving our students an opportunity to discuss themselves as writers. And that's a space that you can go back to, whether your students created that in a notebook or whether they wrote an individual piece, going back to that space and with students and try to, find out who they were as writers or how they describe themselves as writers is a space that tells you how to conference with them too.
Right, definitely, definitely. So we're going to take a look at the 5th grade narrative standard, where these students are expected to write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, descriptive details, and clear event sequences. There's a number of standards and elements there, right? So let's take a look at, this is a 5th grade student's personal narrative. I kept his underlining because I thought it was important because his teacher had asked him, I want you to underline all the sentences that you're really proud of. Okay. And I love that he almost underlined the entire essay. Because why would you not? I'm proud of everything that I have, right? So let's take a look at it. It was May 31st, 2016. I waited for 4.5 hours to arrive at my destination, California. I went there on summer break. The only reason why I went was to have fun. A couple of days after we got to California, we went to one of its biggest tourist attractions, Disneyland. I was in awe when I saw the place. It was 60th year anniversary celebration. I was excited. Due to the fact that school in California hadn't let out yet, it wasn't as crowded as it would have been in the dead middle of summer. But nonetheless, it was still crowded. It was a nice 85-degree sunny Southern California day. There were so many rides. I couldn't get on all of them due to the lengths of the rides. My favorite ride was the one called It's a Small World. It was about all the heritages around the world. It was a waterlog ride, the type that you can dip your hands into the shallow water and feel the cooling sensation the water provided. As the day was coming to an end, 2 things happened. 1, a Disney movie-themed parade with all the Disney characters you've seen. 2nd, they've held the biggest, most spectacular fireworks show I've ever witnessed. The fireworks show also circulated around Disney movie themes. This will be an experience I will never forget.
Wow.
Pretty good, right?
Pretty good.
Pretty impressive.
Rich language. So, again, we went through this exercise somewhat in session 1, but I don't think you can ever do it too much because conferencing with students means that you're always looking for strengths and areas for growth. And, as you noted here, what are some strengths? What are some possible mini lessons?
Right. And that's what we're trying to see. Like, if I'm using conferencing as an assessment tool, I'm trying to see what they did well, what standards did they meet, but also I'm using it as an assessment tool to inform my teaching, right? So where can I take this? Where would I go next? So some possible things that I could use. I would definitely have sat here with the student and been like, oh my goodness, your voice and sensory language was amazing, and giving examples of what that is, not just giving sensory language, saying, oh, it was the dead middle of summer, the type you can dip your hands into the shallow water. I could actually feel my hands going in there. You definitely picture for me as the reader. So when you're
it was as if the student created your lesson for you.
Exactly.
That was a mentor test.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I would definitely, when the students do have amazing writing, I would always use theirs as mentor text. I would pull it up, he did this amazing. Let's take a look at this. But definitely pointing it out, being clear, and building up. Because if you say that, the next thing you know, like when I used to give positive feedback, oh my goodness, I really loved the way you used this hyperbole. The next writing, they'd have 8 hyperboles.
Right, of course.
So when you point out and give feedback of what they're doing great, they're going to continue to do it.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we're doing that,
context, for sure.
And then pulling out, so he had a clear sequence of events, which is one of the standards elements as well. I could talk about how he organized in paragraphs, and it was easy for me as the reader to understand what was happening, and he moved from beginning to end. Areas for growth might be possibly spend more time establishing the situation. Who went with you? Provide a little bit more hook for the reader. Grab their attention. One of the elements in the standard is to include more dialogue or more descriptions.
Yeah.
So I would be like, where could we have maybe put some dialogue in here to help or some more description. You say it was, you walked in and you were in awe of Disneyland. Could you have used a little bit more description and painted a picture for me as the reader? I know that you're in awe, but help me as the reader be in awe as well. So, and then I wouldn't necessarily tell them what that looked like. I pull it out of them as a writer, right?
So here's an example also of where you can use one piece of writing to layer and scaffold, bigger writing. Use this one piece, and now I'm going to teach dialogue, right? And so you can extend the writing based on one piece.
Exactly. And so maybe some next steps, like you've definitely had this conversation with them, they can go back and he can go back and put dialogue and descriptions in there. But then also my notes from the conference, I'm saying, hey, possible mini lessons. I can go back and specifically, explicitly teach what dialogue and descriptions and pacing looks like in an essay. So this is one conference that you had. Throughout, when you're conferencing with all your students, you start to make note. If you're noticing that no one's using dialogue, no one's using descriptions, then that's definitely going to guide your instruction, right? Or if you notice that, hey, I know I already taught in introductions when it comes to narrative, but maybe we need to revisit that again. Maybe we need to revisit what it looks like. So you start to use these conferencing as an assessment tool, which I think not really a lot of people think of them as an assessment tool.
Right. It certainly can be used that way. And I think another thing that we can't forget, as we move along, is that as teachers, we're also being assessed, right? And so these teacher keys of effectiveness that are out give us an opportunity to sort of assess ourselves, see where we are as teachers, see what we're doing and what we could do to improve in terms of aligning student assessment with the curriculum and benchmarks. And I wonder if that's happening enough in writing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that it was always really impressive to my administrators. I hope y'all are watching this. When I would walk in with my writer's notebook, my conferencing notebook, and a student portfolio, because I kept all of their writing. And so to walk in with a writing notebook where I can assess where I've conferenced, why I've chosen the mini lessons that I have based on data, and then the rubrics that I've been using, and could assess where my students are with each element and each standard. It's a powerful tool.
Yeah.
It also makes parent-teacher conferences really powerful as well. I could pull out and show where a student was great, writing at the beginning of the year to where they are in February, and show their strengths and where they've grown. It was powerful to the parents. It was also powerful to the students. The students really loved looking back at their writing portfolios and seeing where they grew as writers as well.
Yeah, it's a great map.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful map. So I think, there's some really, we flooded you with information,
right.
But, there's some key points that we hope that you take away from this. And again, just reiterating this notion that writing truly is about a process. Not that the product doesn't matter. It definitely is a source for us. But if we are engaging students in the process along the way and utilizing formative assessment, then our product is going to be that much stronger.
Exactly. I mean, our goal is to build writers. That's really our goal. If we are building writers and we're giving them those tools, then honestly, those summative assessments are no problem, right? And that's where we want to get to a point to, where we are doing these things and it's a process, and we're conferring with our students and we're providing feedback throughout, that by the time that summative assessment does come, where that county genre writing task is implemented, and we have the 5th grade writing task, that it's no big deal.
Right.
They're going to do great because they have the tools. We've been giving them the tools the entire year.
Yeah, and they've been writing. They've been actually writing and making sure that, again, that you're assessing throughout.
Right.
With formative assessment and conferencing with them, and then planning lessons based on the actual data. That's really, really a recursive process that can be going on in multiple disciplinary areas.
Yes.
In a variety of ways, using multiple tools.
Right. So just to reiterate, yes, we want them writing in every subject, but the writing process is going to have to be taught somewhere, and feedback is going to have to be given back somewhere. So even if you're the science teacher and they're writing a constructive response in your classroom, I feel like it's your responsibility to give some kind of feedback on their writing as well, not just address the science standards. Same with social studies. So like, we're building a culture of writing, really. I know I'm going back to the title of the thing, but we really are. Within our school, within your team, writing is going to be taught through every subject. Assessing writing should be done in every subject as well.
That's right, and explicitly teaching it.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times teachers just let students loose to write a narrative without having modeled or explicitly taught.
Right.
What does that mean? What does it sound like
Exactly.
to hear a narrative that's descriptive and that provides me with something that I can visualize? And so writing is something that is explicit, is something that is pointed out and noted, again, through mentor text. Identifying when you read during read aloud time, you're actually teaching writing, right? So if you're pulling out those stellar examples in Cynthia Ryland's book, when she said, has that pattern narrative, when I grew up in the mountains, just going back and teaching those elements as tools, that's important. So
Right.
through reading, we're also teaching writing and noting that.
Writing is one of the most cognitively loaded tasks we give our students. And now when we're getting back to this text-based writing, it adds a whole nother cognitive load of reading and comprehending and comparing to text and responding to a prompt and writing to it and assessing along the way and providing feedback and building them up as a writer is going to kind of give them the confidence to tackle these challenging tasks we're giving them.
Yeah, it's truly a bundle of skills, that's
Right.
for sure.
So,
well, again, we would love to take any questions that you have at this point, and thank you for attending this session and for listening in. We will provide our email addresses if you
Yes.
do have questions afterwards, but right now we're going to open it up to live questions.
Okay. One question for Julie is, how long were your conferences with your particular students?
okay, I tried to keep them to 3 to 5 minutes. And I know that sounds like not a lot of time, but when they came with point out something that you want me to look at, they knew our routines, and then I would also have tried as much as possible to read the essays ahead of time. I kept their notebooks and read them ahead of time, so I already had some notes, so I didn't have to read the essay in the conference. So then I could get through a conference in 3 to 5 minutes. I could also, having read them before, group them in small groups if they were working on the same skill. They needed to talk on the same skill. I could pull 5 at once, and then maybe talk to all 5 of them.
And then how often did you confer with everyone?
No one believes this, but I got through every student in my class once a week. And we produced an essay once a week. So it was Monday was kind of we'd start, Friday we have an author share. So it would be 4 mini lessons Monday through Thursday, and Friday they're sharing because they needed an authentic audience. If they were just writing to Miss Owens, I don't really care what she thinks. But if I'm reading it to my peers, if I'm sharing it with others, and when I saw that and I needed that buy-in, then that's kind of the routine that I had.
And then how long was your writing block?
90 minutes. We had 3 90-minute blocks. I taught, really writing was 45 minutes because I taught reading and writing. And some days, if we were diving into a new piece and I needed all 90 minutes, I'd go 90, and then the next day would spend all day with reading the next day. But I could combine them really beautifully often.
Okay. That's all the questions we have for now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Gardner, for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, we appreciate our presenters, and right now we're going to hear from Didi Bunn, who's going to offer some principles on universal design for learning.
I guess the first thing I need to start off with saying is wow, and I've been taking notes on this and practically everything they talked about fit into universal design for learning. So trying to go back and repeat all of those things, we'd be here another 90 minutes. So we don't want to do that. But I think the important thing to remember is that when we're looking at universal design for learning, it really is a way to look at your instruction and plan how you're going to support your students, not only supporting your students, but expanding the choices and expanding your students' skills as you go through. They had so many different things that they talked about in here that fit into the ways that we can do this. But since this is about assessment, pointing out that the formative assessment is such a critical part of it. Summative assessment is also important, but when we look at it, we want to assess for learning. We want to look at how students, what students need. You know, what are the areas that we need to go in and support? And you're going to have a wide variety of levels within your class. And then as you're moving along through your instruction, you want to assess their learning as they're going, as they're moving along. And then finally, the summative assessment is going to be assessing what did they learn. So building that in as you go through. I love the way that they talked about student perspectives and taking an inquiring stance, and that allows you to plan your instruction to consider the needs of all those students, not only to reduce or eliminate possible barriers when you're assessing or when you're teaching that instruction, but also on how you can expand their writing, how you can move them forward as they're going. The idea of checklists to provide options for you when you're assessing, that can allow you to build in flexibility for your assessment and for your instruction as you're moving along. You know, looking at patterns, I love that. I thought that was so good when you're talking about not only patterns for individual students, but patterns across the classroom. And that's going to help you when you're designing your instruction. The statement that you had about adjusting rubrics to meet the individual needs of your students and of your classroom, I think is critical. Not just using something that's out of the box, because if you're doing that, you may miss what's going on in that classroom. By focusing on the process, I think that's just such a, I loved when you said that, both of you. I thought that was so good. You know, one of the things that I loved was one of the rubrics that you showed when you were talking about analytic rubrics. And you had your standards color-coded, and then you had the rubric color-coded to meet those standards. Right. So that was a great idea when you're giving it to students to self-assess so that they can match those up much more easily. That was a great little way to do that. Conferencing is just, I don't know how to say many more about that. It's such an important part, you know, and it does engage your students. And I think one of the issues that we often have when we're looking at students in writing is getting them engaged in that writing process. And by conferencing with them and allowing them to be a contributor to that conference, or doing the peer conferencing, is another way to really keep your students engaged. And then the last thing you talked about when you talked about having an audience that is an authentic audience is such an important thing. So all of the things that they said in here fit so nicely into the things that you want to think about for universal design for learning. So thank you. Okay. Oh, thank you. There is one thing that I wanted to point out to you. We are in the process of doing a series of videos on universal design for learning. This is with 3 other states. We're working with, or 2 other states. We're working with Indiana and with Ohio. And we can record the webinars that we do, and we're going to have them posted on the Godot website, but there is also going to be a schedule of the webinars that are still left to go on. If you go to the Godot site and go to the Division for Special Education Students, Special Education Services and Supports, excuse me, there will be a link down on the left-hand side of the page that says Universal Design and Learning Live Webinar Schedule. That will take you to the page that you are seeing now. And you see the live webinar series link that will take you to all of the webinars that and registration links for webinars on universal design for learning. And then underneath that, you will see the first webinar that was conducted by Georgia, which is called Understanding UDO Guidelines, a Primer, which is a 30-minute webinar on the basics of universal design for learning. Okay, thank you.
We want to thank our presenters today, Dr. Roberta Gardner as well as Julie Owens. We appreciate your time and energy. We heard some great, received some great comments and feedback during this session. And we thank you all, our viewing audience, for participating in this second session of Assessing Writing. We, as you prepare to leave, remember that the follow-up professional learning has a twofold purpose. One, to guide implementation back in your respective classrooms, and two, to provide consistent implementation across the state. Be sure to complete the survey that is located on GeorgiaStandards.Org. There you will also find the recording of this session along with the first session, and we look forward to seeing you on Twitter. Remember to use the hashtag Culture of Writing, and stay tuned. Next month is the K-5 Session 3 Writing Genres. Thank you for attending.